Welcome back to Sociology 227. This is Julian Go, Video 1. We've got 3 jobs in this video. First, I'm going to introduce you to the concepts of colonialism and postcolonialism, and what sociologists mean when they use these terms. Next, I want to introduce you to 3 different ways to look at the post-colonial period: the materialist, the post-structuralist, and the psychoanalytic. This will get you ready to do the readings this week. Let's get started. What do we mean by these 2 terms? One is familiar to you. We'll begin with the colonialism that you're most familiar with, the process through which empires are constituted by taking territory that does not belong to them and using this imperial rule to extract resources to the mother country. This is, of course, the process through which Canada came into existence. So here on the slide, you see a depiction of the famous 1884-1885 Berlin Conference, whereby the European powers divided the continent of Africa into their various spheres of influence. This we call the scramble for Africa. The impact of these decisions is still felt to this day, with most of the colonial boundaries reflected in the borders in the map of Africa in this moment. Here, the European powers meant to divide the continent of Africa into numerous spheres of influence, over which the colonial powers would rule until the 60s, if not much later, leaving their linguistic, institutional, and economic legacies intact. Remember, I addressed this in the Du Bois video last term. In the case of Ghana. We'll return to Du Bois in the next video. What I want to emphasize now is that colonialism as an historical period in which economic and political control is wrested from distant groups on the periphery is only one of the many ways of theorizing the sociology of colonialism. In what follows, I want to address the legacy of colonialism in terms of economic relations, discourses of us versus the other, and finally, in the case of the colonial mentality and personality development. So when we are talking about post-colonialism, we're talking both about the historical developments that have taken place in colonized and colonizer states since times of colonial acquisition, ways of speaking and thinking about colonizer and colonized subjects, and the formation of personalities in the process and aftermath of colonial social relations. To this, Julian Go will add a focus on the sociology of race and racialization. First, we'll begin with Marx and the Marxist tradition. Again, I think this will reflect the colonialism that you guys are most familiar with. As I stated earlier, colonialism is not just the history of European territorial acquisition, but there is a lot of European territorial acquisition to discover. I want to situate the work that Marx and later Marxists were doing at various stages of the worldwide colonial project. As Marx was writing, the British Empire was the dominant material force felt around the world after Napoleon's defeat. A year after Marx's death, the continent of Africa was carved up in the conference we just saw on the last slide. This sets the stage for the theory and praxis of Lenin, who would take imperialism as his avowed opponent. After the Second World War, Marxist political economy would explore how colonialism changed from an explicit form of economic exploitation to a more indirect form. When we talk about the transition from colonialism to neocolonialism, we're addressing the movement from colonial dependence to de jure independence. De jure is just fancy Latin for legally, rather than an actual fact. So we could say that the countries in Africa became independent, with scare quotes, after the Second World War, while still relying heavily on the previously colonial power. So, when we talk about de jure independence, we mean you are independent legally, but dependent in fact. De jure, legally. De facto, in fact. Let's look to Marx and Lenin more closely. Marx addressed colonialism directly throughout his career, in both the early stuff and the later work. Colonialism is an opportunity to expand the market for commodities and presents new forms of labor. The colonial state isn't different from the regular state, again in scare quotes, which aims to maintain property relations. It is just a different bourgeoisie who controls the means of production. Recall I told you guys about what Marx termed the so-called primitive accumulation, whereby commodity relations are established where they didn't exist before. For thinkers like Lenin, imperialism was simply a logical consequence of the economic relations of capital. Capitalism needs new goods, new workers, and new markets. Colonial expansion was the logical consequence of an all-consuming capitalism. As Lenin took over Russia and established the Soviet state following the October Revolution, there was a concerted effort to remove Russia from wars of imperialist aggression, as in the Great War. The height of direct colonialism was the heyday of this first wave of Marxist theory. In this view, colonialism is an imperial center like England stealing land under its protection. Scare quotes again. This is, I think, what comes to mind when you think of colonialism. Here I want to look to two other thinkers from the political economy tradition, Andre Frank and Emanuel Wallerstein. Those of you who take courses in international development will have heard of Andre Frank and his famous work in the development of underdevelopment. Colonial powers were only able to constitute themselves through the exploitation of colonies. In order for England to develop the way it did, to the dominance Marx saw, it had to underdevelop India and Barbados. Frank's position is that countries are not more or less developed, but rather underdeveloped by another. This is a direct challenge to so-called modernization theory, that each society exists in one space or another on a scale of not modern to modern, and we can move forward on that scale by establishing economic and political institutions that allow this to be so. Günter Frank looked to the history of Latin America to prove this. When we're talking about Frank as a dependency theorist, we are suggesting that countries could only develop by underdeveloping others. It is a theorization of economic exploitation through the dependence of both states. Here you have a Marx-ish theory whereby particular core states establish themselves to take advantage of the periphery. Finally, and my favorite when I was an undergrad, Emanuel Wallerstein's world systems theory. First, some background. Günter Frank's argument is rather state-centered, whereas Marx's initial focus is on production. Like Marx, Wallerstein focuses on commodity production and circulation. Rather than address world development in terms of its impact on particular states, Wallerstein looks to particular poles and metropoles through which capital flows. The focus shifts from states getting bad deals and exchanging stuff to capital flows across borders. Günter Frank suggests you can detach from the exploitative relations of global capitalism. For world systems theory, the history of capitalism is, well, history. You can't exist outside of it. Here the state and state actors change. No longer do we have a world only carved up by the colors on the map. Groups like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and other large corporations are the new agents of colonialism, which was one step in the greater system of core-periphery relations. Regardless, both of these ways of thinking are heavy on the structure stuff that I talked to you about last week and last semester. The structure of the global economy is the structure of imperialism, whereas the politics of colonialism and the politics of neocolonialism differ in who and what is causing the economic exploitation to happen. It is in the structure of capitalism that it takes place. These are stories about how actors are positioned in a system of economic relations, of material conditions. Ultimately, these are all varieties of Marxism. Economic relations first, everything else after. We're going to look to Edward Said next and his famous Orientalism for a post-structuralist account of post-colonialism. Here, I want to talk about the most famous thinker of post-colonialism, not only as a time after colonialism happened, but also as a frame through which to engage with identity and identification. When I say post-structuralist, just think Foucault. You can spend time worrying about the exact details if you go to graduate school. Here's Edward Said. His most famous book is entitled Orientalism. In that book, Edward Said uses the thought of Michel Foucault and Marxist Antonio Gramsci to discuss how the Orient is constituted through relations of power knowledge. Following Foucault, for whom all knowledge is constituted through historically emergent and institutionally organized discourses, Said tells us that the West's colonial projects in what we now call the Middle East have shaped that entity as an object of knowledge and action for us, since the age when we brought forth a colonial science which constituted the other. You have all, I assume, seen many of the caricatures of Middle Eastern life, scare quotes, presented on stage and screen. Said argues that the Western engagement with that part of the world, beginning in Napoleon's conquest of Egypt, have constituted such a discursive apparatus. Hence, We in the West have established and acted on a particular discursive apparatus, a way of seeing, thinking, and acting on the world that homogenizes 300 plus million people into a single group, with a religion, with an identity, and with a dangerous agenda. We can call this a unitary process because it was within us in the West and the Western gaze within which this took place. This is crucial. The us of the West and the them of the East, our history and their stagnation, is the outcome of Orientalist discourse, a way of thinking about the Orient as different and other to the Western world. Us, West, them, the other. This is no less structural than the Marxist position because it deals with the structures of knowledge. Said is different from those earlier Marxists because his understanding of discursive production does not take place at the whim of material conditions. Knowledge is not simply an extension of the relations of capital, but is itself a space of contestation and inequality. So we've dealt with both the Marxist and Foucauldian approaches to colonialism and post-colonialism. Finally, I want to turn to the psychoanalytic work of Frantz Fanon. Fanon was born in colonial Martinique and trained as a physician in France. Though trained medically in psychiatry, he became extremely involved in revolutionary anti-colonial politics, most notably in Algeria. I can't do justice to his fascinating biography here, rather I'll look at his first work. Fanon's first book, Black Skin, White Masks, entails a move from Freud's focus on family relations and personal development to colonial relations and personality development. Fanon argues that the colonial relations introduce a psychic malady facing the colonized population. Freud argues that our personality development, normal or pathological, emerges from our psychosexual development, earliest in the family. Fanon takes this to the level of social structure under colonial rule. Freud advocates for psychoanalytic therapy to reveal repressed emotions that cause mental pathology. Fanon argues for violent revolution to overturn the colonial order and its associated psychic damage to the colonized population. We shall attempt to discover the various mental attitudes the black man adopts in the face of white civilization. Like Freud, the book has some very cringeworthy and sexist components. It also has brilliant passages as well. Fanon's anger is apparent, guided or misguided as it may be. I want to emphasize that Fanon argues that colonialism isn't just something that happens at the level of the state or at the level of discourse. It comes to haunt the very basis of who we are. It isn't just found in a map, on a balance sheet, or in the literary tradition, but our most basic psychic composition. This is so for both the colonized and the colonizer. Direct colonialism might be over, but the damage remains. We'll talk more about Freud and the psychic consequences of oppression in the video on Judith Butler, coming up later in the course. This should give you what you need to get through the readings. See you after you do them.